Chapter 71. Entrusted by someone to protect you. Translator. Henry, you are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 71. Entrusted by someone to protect you. Translator. Henry Translations Editor. Henry Translations. In the blink of an eye, 8 hours passed. Lin Ran kept looking at himself in the mirror and practicing the facial expressions that Hua Qian had said. In the end, Lin Ran felt his entire face stiffen. The rebellious feeling in his heart reached its peak. He slapped the mirror away and said angrily, "I'm done. I'm not practicing anymore. I'll cover my face tomorrow. If anyone dares to doubt me, I'll stab him. Don't move." Hua Qian suddenly widened his eyes and pointed at Lin Ran in surprise. "Your expression is especially good now. You already look like Grandpa Sword God." When Lin Ran heard this, he hurriedly picked up the mirror. However, when he saw his fierce face in the mirror, he suddenly felt a little complicated. Is 10 Miles Sword God usually so angry? Looking. How unhappy is his life? Lin Ran subconsciously complained. As soon as he finished speaking, he realized that Hua Qian's expression had darkened. He quickly pressed his palms together and bowed to the sky to apologize to the 10 Miles Sword God. Only then did Hua Qian's expression soften a little. He rolled his eyes at Lin Ran and said angrily, "What do you know? Grandpa Sword God cares about the people of the world. His unhappiness is not for himself, but for the people." Lin Ran nodded and didn't refute. To a brainless fan like Hua Qian, no negative comments about the 10 Miles Sword God were allowed, so Lin Ran couldn't be bothered to argue with him. After Lin Ran massaged his face and rested for 5 minutes, Hua Qian stood up again. "That's all for facial expressions. Next, I'll teach you Grandpa Sword God's posture." "Wait a minute." Lin Ran quickly made a pause gesture. "Let me ask you something first. Is the posture strange?" "Don't worry, Grandpa Sword God's usual posture is very simple." As Hua Qian spoke, he first tied the sword to the left side of his belt with a rope. Then, he placed his hands behind his back and stepped forward with his left foot. Lin Ran waited for half a minute, but seeing that Hua Qian wasn't moving, he couldn't help but ask curiously, "That's it? That's it?" Lin Ran didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "Next time, just tell me to stand at ease." As he spoke, Lin Ran stood up and stood at ease. Before he transmigrated, he had been trained at a military camp and was familiar with the command, "Stand at ease." After putting on that fierce-looking facial expression, Lin Ran immediately realized that Hua Qian's gaze had changed. It was a look of nostalgia and sadness. Without Hua Qian saying anything, Lin Ran knew that he had already graduated from the 10 Miles Sword God impersonation crash course. "Take a rest first. I'll go get something." With that, Hua Qian turned around and left. The moment he turned around, Lin Ran saw that his eyes were red. This was the greatest compliment for Lin Ran's impersonation, but Lin Ran looked a little worried, wondering how the Empress would react when she saw him looking almost exactly like Sword God. For some reason, Lin Ran recalled that when he was helping the Empress remove the poison, the Empress looked like an aggrieved little girl who was crying in his arms. It was unfortunate for a young girl to bear the fate of the entire dynasty. An innocent girl was forced to become a decisive and cold emperor. Moreover, she had to hide her identity from everyone. Before Lin Ran entered the palace, she didn't even have anyone to pour out her heart. Lin Ran had only practiced impersonating someone for 8 hours, but he had already thought of giving up several times. However, the Empress had to impersonate someone for years. Thinking of this, Lin Ran suddenly felt his heart ache for her. She was carrying too much. Lin Ran didn't know how much courage it took, but he knew that he couldn't do it. "I was entrusted by Sword God to protect you. With me around, you don't have to bear it alone." Lin Ran adjusted his expression before continuing to practice seriously in the mirror. It was not until past midnight that Hua Qian returned with a flat wooden box in his hand. Lin Ran had seen this wooden box before. Previously, when the Empress asked him to pretend to be her to sleep with the consorts, he used this box to store the human skin mask. Opening the wooden box, there was indeed a human skin mask inside, but the material seemed to be different. Beside it were a few small porcelain jars and 3 strands of black and white beard. Because you're going to show up during the day tomorrow, the requirements for the human skin mask are higher. It will take a while for this mask to fit your face completely. I'll dress you up in a while. Otherwise, there won't be enough time. As Hua Qian spoke, he started working. His eyes were still a little red, and his voice was hoarse. It was obvious that he had just cried. Lin Ran pretended to not notice it. He agreed and sat down in front of the mirror, letting Hua Qian do his face. High-level human skin masks were different. Even the process of wearing it was much more complicated. The one that the Empress had given to him previously only needed to be dipped in water before he put it on his face. However, before wearing this mask, he had to shave his fine hair to prevent it from affecting the effect of the mask. If Lin Ran hadn't objected strongly, Hua Qian would have shaved off his eyebrows. After finishing the preparatory work, Hua Qian took out a small porcelain jar. After opening it, there was something translucent and sticky inside. He dipped a small brush into it and carefully applied it to every corner of Lin Ran's face. When it reached his eyebrows, Lin Ran suddenly thought of something and asked, "This thing is so sticky. Will my eyebrows be peeled off when I take off the mask?" "Who knows?" Hua Qian shrugged indifferently and patted Lin Ran. "Don't move or speak. Otherwise, if my hand slipped, your entire face would be ruined." Lin Ran didn't dare to move. He didn't particularly care about his appearance, but that didn't mean he could accept a balding hairstyle. With Lin Ran's cooperation, the paste was quickly applied. When the surface of the paste was a little dry, Hua Qian picked up the human skin mask in the box and carefully covered Lin Ran's face. Then, he used his thumb to press it carefully from bottom to top. This process was very long. In order to cooperate, Lin Ran kept his eyes closed. Just as he was about to fall asleep, he finally heard Hua Qian's voice. "It's done." When Lin Ran opened his eyes, he realized that his face had changed completely. The eyebrows and beard had yet to be put on, so he looked a little strange at first glance. There were more than 10 wrinkles on his forehead and at the corners of his eyes. His face was old, but he didn't have a strand of gray hair, which made him look strange. He looked at the mirror for a moment and suddenly had a strange feeling. He seemed to have seen this face somewhere before. Chapter 72. Unintentional Realization. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 72. Unintentional Realization. Translator. Henyi Translations Editor. Henyi Translations. This sense of familiarity was different from seeing a common face on the street. It was a real sense of familiarity. However, this face seemed to be missing a certain characteristic, so he couldn't connect it to a specific person. But how was that possible? This was the face of the 10 Miles Sword God. When Lin Ran found the Sword God's remains on Mount Sword, the pile of bones was at least decades old. At that time, he had yet to transmigrate. How could he have seen this face? Could it be someone he knew before transmigrating? Eyebrows. Beards. Lin Ran patted Hua Qian. "Hurry. Put it all on my face." "No, we have to wait for the adhesive to dry out first." Hua Qian shook his head. As if sensing Lin Ran's anxiety, he added, "An hour. Just wait another hour." Lin Ran had no choice but to grit his teeth and continue waiting. However, in anxiety, every second felt like a year for him. In the end, Lin Ran felt his cheeks turn numb. Just as he couldn't help but want to do it himself, Hua Qian, who was meditating at the side, suddenly stood up. "Close your eyes." Lin Ran immediately closed his eyes and heard Hua Qian take something and slowly place it on his brow. Although there was a human skin mask on his face, he still felt a furry sensation. The process of applying the beards and eyebrows was very fast. In just 2 to 3 minutes, Hua Qian was done. Lin Ran hurriedly opened his eyes to look at himself in the mirror. With gray eyebrows and beards, his face became more distinct. But even so, Lin Ran still couldn't connect this face with someone. He felt that there was still something missing. Lin Ran looked at Hua Qian. Is there nothing else? Hua Qian shook his head in confusion. No, the last step is to dye your hair gray. We can do that tomorrow. No, you must have forgotten something. Lin Ran said excitedly. That familiar feeling had reached its peak. He was so close to catching it. Think about it again. There must be something else. For example, age spots, buck teeth, eye patch. At the mention of eye patch, Lin Ran suddenly thought of something. He raised a hand to block his eyes and looked at the face in the mirror through his fingers. Boom! Lin Ran was struck dumb. After he covered his eyes, his face was exactly the same as Daoist Li's. Daoist Li was blind, and his eyeballs were all white. Every time Lin Ran saw him, his attention was on his eyes. Therefore, in Lin Ran's memory, a pair of white eyes was Daoist Li's facial features. It was also because of this that he did not recognize this face immediately. But how was this possible? Daoist Li actually looked exactly the same as the 10-mile sword god. Twins. Or was he the real 10-mile sword god? But if Daoist Li was the 10-mile sword god, who was the skeleton in the cave on Mount Sword? Was it the sealed demon? After recognizing this face, countless questions surged out like a fountain. Lin Ran felt that his mind was about to explode, but he quickly thought of a key question. Daoist Li looked exactly like the 10-mile sword god. Did the Empress know about this? Obviously, she knew. Then why had she never mentioned it? Lin Ran couldn't figure it out. If it were any other time, he would put the questions to the back of his mind in no time. But now, he was in the same boat as the Empress. This feeling of not being trusted made him very unhappy. This is the sword technique left behind by Sword God. Take a look yourself. I need to go out for a while. Lin ran through the sword technique he had written to Hua Qian and left. At this point, in another 2 hours, it would be dawn. Logically speaking, the Empress should be resting in the bedroom at this moment, but tomorrow was the state banquet. There were too many things for her to deal with, so Lin Ran did not go to the bedroom. Instead, he went straight to the imperial study. As expected, the imperial study was brightly lit. Countless eunuchs came in and out. Although no one spoke, one could feel the busy atmosphere in the air. Lin Ran was in a hurry to clarify the doubts in his heart. Without waiting for the eunuch to inform the Empress, he walked in. The Empress was still sitting in front of the desk and was explaining something to Li Tianyi. When she saw someone coming in, she subconsciously took a look. Then, her body trembled and her eyes instantly turned red. Li Tianyi, who was at the side, also revealed a strange expression. Being calm, he had naturally seen the 10-mile sword god before. Although he would occasionally meet sword god in the palace these few days, his face was covered. Now that he suddenly saw this familiar face, it immediately evoked many memories. Fortunately, the Empress did not lose her composure in front of everyone. She took a deep breath and held back her tears. She instructed Li Tianyi, "You all can leave first. No one is allowed to enter without my permission." "Yes, Your Majesty." Li Tianyi nodded and went out with the eunuchs. He even tactfully closed the door. The Empress couldn't keep calm anymore and immediately walked forward. She reached out, wanting to hug Lin Ran with tears in her eyes, but she suddenly frowned and asked, "Lord Lin. As expected, I can't fool you." Lin Ran chuckled strangely. Anyone could hear the displease in his voice. The Empress smiled and wiped the tears from the corners of her eyes. Don't be discouraged. You already look very much like Grandpa Sword God. It's just that your eyes betrayed your inexperience in life. After all, you're still young. There's nothing you can do about that. I'm not here to hear you praise me. Lin Ran said coldly, do you still remember Daoist Li from Mount Sword? Of course I remember. The Empress nodded as if she knew what Lin Ran wanted to ask. Without waiting for him to speak, she smiled and said, what a coincidence. Other than his eyes, he looks almost identical to Grandpa Sword God. Seeing that the Empress admitted it so readily, Lin Ran was a little at a loss. He was stunned for a moment before continuing to ask, then why haven't I heard you mention it before? Why did I have to mention it? The Empress asked in confusion, as if she did not understand this question. There has to be an opportunity for me to bring this up. You've never asked about Grandpa Sword God's appearance. Why did I have to mention it for no reason? Lin Ran was speechless. Only then did he remember that the person in front of him was the current emperor, not his female classmates who liked gossiping. There was no way the Empress would suddenly come to him one day and say, do you know that Daoist Li from Mount Sword looks exactly the same as the 10-mile sword god? Thinking of what the Empress had just said, Lin Ran was so embarrassed that his toes curled up. However, this embarrassment was quickly gone. Initially, Lin Ran only wanted to ask a question, but now that he looked into the Empress's eyes, perhaps it was because of the tacit understanding between the two of them or his sharp intuition, he was almost 100% sure that this woman was hiding something very important from him. Chapter 73. What was the Empress hiding? You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 73. What was the Empress hiding? Translator. Henyi Translations Editor. Henyi Translations, there's something you're not telling me. Lin Ran went straight to the point and said in a firm tone. Almost at the same time, he saw a trace of panic flash across the Empress's eyes. The panic disappeared in a flash. The Empress curled her lips and revealed a playful expression. What nonsense are you talking about? In this palace, I trust you and Qian the most. Why would I hide anything from you? Lin Ran didn't say anything and just stared at the Empress with a fierce expression. This was a technique he had just learned from Hua Qian. He named it, pressure of silence. Even though the 10-mile sword god had an extraordinary status, he was not omniscient. Most of the time, he had to obtain some information through asking. As expected, the Empress only lasted for half a minute under the pressure. You're cheating. The Empress pouted and said aggrievedly with tears in her eyes. No one would associate her with the emperor of a country. Lin Ran couldn't help but be moved. He retracted his gaze and said helplessly, I didn't want to do this either. It's you who doesn't want to cooperate. The Empress seemed to be still angry. She pouted and didn't look at Lin Ran. Lin Ran didn't know how to coax her, so he could only wait patiently for her to calm down. Fortunately, the Empress was not a grumpy person. After a few minutes, she calmed down. You're right. I'm hiding something from you. The Empress returned to her usual calm self. She looked at Lin Ran and said seriously, at first, I didn't tell you because this matter might concern your life and death. I was worried that you would be afraid and escape. Later, I didn't tell you because this matter can't threaten you anymore. It's pointless to bring it up. Lin Ran said flatly, go to the point. The Empress sighed and seemed to be a little conflicted. After a few seconds, she said, how about this? It's getting late. Go back and rest first. After the banquet is over, I'll tell you the whole thing. Lin Ran frowned. This sounded like an excuse to stall for time. After the state banquet, the Empress might turn hostile and refuse to admit it. If that was the case, he really couldn't do anything to the Empress. Even so, Lin Ran still nodded in agreement. The two of them had worked together for so long. Even if they did not go through thick and thin together, they should still trust each other. I'll be very sad if you go back on your word. With that, Lin Ran left the imperial study. When he returned to Mingzhou Hall, Hua Qiyun was still reading the sword technique. His expression was sometimes stunned and sometimes puzzled, but most of the time, he was puzzled. Seeing Lin Ran enter, Hua Qiyun immediately leaned over and asked with a frown, "Did you remember this sword technique wrongly? Why can't I understand most of it?" Lin Ran didn't get the answer he wanted and was in a bad mood. When he heard this, he retorted, "Of course. This is the sword technique left behind by the 10 miles sword god. If it's so easy to understand, wouldn't everyone be able to become the sword god?" After saying that, Lin Ran felt a little proud. When he saw the sword technique in the cave, although he didn't master it at first glance, he could at least understand it. Genius. Not so much. Lin Ran thought smugly to himself. Seeing Hua Qiyun rack his brain, trying to understand it, Lin Ran's heart suddenly softened. He comforted him, "It took me at least a year to learn this sword technique, so don't worry. Memorize it first. Otherwise, you won't understand even if I teach you." "Alright. I'll memorize it." After being encouraged, Hua Qiyun was instantly motivated and went near the oil lamp to continue reading it seriously. Lin Ran couldn't help but laugh before lying down on the bed. There was still a major event tomorrow. As the main character, he had to rest well. When Lin Ran opened his eyes again, it was already 10 o'clock the next day. There was only an hour left until the state banquet at noon. The reason why he knew it was because he was forcefully pulled up by Hua Qiyun. "Hurry up. Your hair hasn't been dyed yet. It'll be too late if you dawdle any longer." As Hua Qiyun spoke, he pulled the groggy Lin Ran to a chair and began to fiddle with his tools. When Lin Ran was completely awake, his black hair had already turned gray. Coupled with his aged-old face, even if he didn't show any expression, he looked like a senior master. Then, Lin Ran changed into a black robe. There were dragon patterns embroidered with golden thread on his clothes and sleeves. Logically speaking, this was a pattern that only the royal family could use. However, with 10 miles sword god status, no one would dare to find fault with him. After everything was prepared, Hua Qiyun brought over a long wooden box. Sensing the familiar sword intent, Lin Ran couldn't help but smile. After opening it, it was indeed the sword god's sword, 10 miles dragon roar. 10 miles dragon roar was broken, so in order to hide the broken part, the empress specially equipped a scabbard for this sword. The scabbard was made of metal with a 5-clawed golden dragon coiling around it. The dragon's body happened to be connected to the dragon head on the sword hilt. There were also 7 rubies on the scabbard, arranged in the pattern of the Big Dipper, which reflected the dragon-patterned rubies on the hilt. Lin Ran couldn't help but praise, "It's as if this scabbard was tailor-made for the 10 miles dragon roar." When Hua Qiyun heard this, he looked at Lin Ran in disdain. "Why are you talking about? This is the original scabbard of the 10 miles dragon roar." Lin Ran was stunned when he heard this. Back then, he only found the broken dragon roar in the cave and thought that this sword did not have a scabbard. He did not expect that the scabbard had always been in the palace. But why wasn't the scabbard and sword together? Lin Ran vaguely felt that this might have something to do with the thing the empress was hiding from him. Anyway, he could get the answer after the state banquet, so he put it to the back of his mind for the time being. With the 10 miles dragon roar, all the preparations were ready. Hua Qiyun also grabbed his sword and pushed open the door of Mingzhou Hall. He turned around and cupped his hands solemnly. "Grandpa Sword God. Let's go." Lin Ran nodded and walked out of Mingzhou Hall with his hands behind his back. The moment he walked out of the door and looked at the reverent gazes of the palace guards around him, Lin Ran suddenly had a strange feeling, as if he had always been the sword god. Chapter 74. State Banquet, Undercurrents. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 74. State Banquet, Undercurrents. Translator. Henyi Translations Editor. Henyi Translations NV. After passing through the gate of supreme harmony, they arrived at the yard in front of the throne room. It was different from the usual solemn atmosphere. Today, the drums in the yard were playing. There were about 300 tables placed on both sides of the main road. Right behind the tables were cushions for the guests to sit on. 30 steps behind the tea table were 300 palace guards. All of them had their hands on their swords and their backs were straight. In front of the Hall of Supreme Harmony, there was a long table facing the gate. The Empress was sitting behind the table, wearing a black robe embroidered with golden dragons and a 9-dragon crown on her head. She looked around with supreme dignity. On the right side of the long table, there was a mahogany table. Its position and height were all equal to the long table. This meant that the status of the person at this table was not inferior to the current emperor. When it was almost noon, a young eunuch rushed in from outside the gate of supreme harmony. After whispering a few words into Li Tiany's ear, he bowed and left. Li Tiany raised his head to look at the sky again. Then, he bowed to the Empress and said, "Your Majesty, there's still 15 minutes before noon. There are 261 martial artists waiting outside the gate." The Empress nodded and said calmly, "Open the gate." "Yes, Your Majesty." Li Tiany bowed. Then, he stood up and faced the gate of supreme harmony. He raised his voice and shouted, "His Majesty has decreed that the martial artists of the martial world are allowed to enter." As soon as he finished speaking, the yard was filled with music. 2 young eunuchs walked in front with a signboard and led the way. 261 martial artists cupped their fists and bowed. They knelt in front of the long table and said, "Greetings, Your Majesty." "Everyone, rise." Everyone stood up. However, they still lowered their heads and did not dare to look around. If they lifted their heads without being asked to do so by the emperor, it would be considered a crime punishable by death. Although most of these people were sect masters, at this moment, they had to abide by the rules of the palace. After everyone stood up, Li Tiany took out a roll of yellow silk from his sleeve and unfolded it. "Sect Master Son of the Dark Cloud Sect. Please take a seat in the first row. Master Lu of the 8-Directional Mountain. Please take a seat in the second row. Elder Li of the Time Immemorial Cave. Please take a seat in the third row." Every time Li Tiany called a name, the corresponding people would walk out of the line and walk to their seats after cupping their hands in gratitude. However, no one sat down. They only stood beside their seats with their hands by their sides. This was also a rule in the palace. Only when the emperor gave the order would they be allowed to sit down. However, when Li Tiany was about to announce the 7th guest, an accident happened. "Elder Song of the Thousand Peak. Please take a seat in the 7th row." As soon as Li Tiany called out his name, a white-haired old man was about to thank the Empress when a rough voice suddenly shouted from a few feet away, "Your Majesty. I have something to say." At this moment, the Empress was resting with her eyes closed. When she heard the voice, she opened her eyes and looked over. She realized that the person who spoke was a burly man. This person looked to be in his 40s. He had a tall nose and a wide mouth. His abnormally tall figure was very eye-catching in the crowd. He knew that he was entering the palace to meet the emperor, but he was only wearing a tattered shirt. The muscles on his arms and chest were bulging, shining under the sun. Although this person cupped his hands and lowered his head, anyone could tell that he was not sincere in doing that. The Empress thought to herself, "What should come has come." Then, she asked, "What do you have to say?" The burly man cupped his fists again and replied in a low voice, "I wonder how the seers are arranged." Li Tiany frowned. "How dare you? You have to use honorifics when replying to His Majesty. Did no one teach you?" The burly man was not intimidated when he heard that. He raised his head and glared at Li Tiany. "I'm a boor. I can't learn your rules." Li Tianyi was so angry that his face turned red. He widened his eyes and was about to call for the guards when the Empress raised her hand to stop him. Uniquely, this martial artist must be used to being carefree. It's understandable that he's unfamiliar with palace etiquette. It's fine. The Empress smiled, then looked at the burly man and replied, the seats are arranged according to the ranking on the sacred martial roll. Is there a problem? The sacred martial roll was the ranking of the sects in the Heavenly Saint dynasty. Every July, an arena would be set up in the capital. The various sects would go on stage to spar and determine their status in the martial world. Although some sects deliberately lost or forfeited in order to hide their strength, overall, the rankings on the sacred martial roll were still relatively reliable. The burly man laughed when he heard that. Your Majesty. I have something to say about this. My name is Tainyo. I'm the chief disciple of the Northern Mystic Gate. Last year, in the arena, my sect tied with the Thousand Peaks sect. Why are they given a seat in the 7th row while I have to sit behind them? As soon as he finished speaking, the atmosphere became strange. It was as if there was an undercurrent under the calm lake. The martial artists knew for a fact that today's state banquet was not held to thank them for offering a hand in the rebellion. Now that the 10-mile sword god had come out of seclusion, this state banquet was most likely an occasion to test their loyalty. However, the sword god's coming out of seclusion had always been a rumor. None of them had seen him with their own eyes. Now was a good opportunity to find it out. How could the Empress not know what these people were thinking? She sneered in her heart and looked at the white-haired old man who was about to bow. Elder Song, is what he said true? The Thousand Peaks sect had always supported the royal family. When Elder Song heard this, he immediately said, Your Majesty. Everything Tainyo said is true. The Empress nodded. Then are you willing to change seats with him? Elder Song cupped his hands. As you command, Your Majesty. Pfft. What a bootlicker. Someone in the crowd sneered. The Empress pretended not to hear it. She raised her hand and instructed, since Elder Song has no objections, Tainyo, take the seat in the 7th row. Thank you, Your Majesty. Tainyo agreed and walked to his seat. He sat down and began to scratch his feet. The sect masters and elders frowned when they saw this, but since His Majesty did not say anything, they naturally did not dare to say anything. When Elder Song walked up to his seat, Li Tianyi continued announcing the remaining seats. After about 10 minutes, the 216 seats were allocated. During this period, there were a few people who stood up to cause trouble. Although they were not as rude as Tainyo, they were clearly trying to test the Empress. The strange thing was that the Empress was not angry at all. Instead, she calmed them down one by one. Some people could not help but suspect if the rumor about the sword god was real, but little did they know that the Empress had remembered everyone who dared to challenge her just now. At the same time, outside the gate of Supreme Harmony, Lin Ran and Hua Qian had already arrived. They had heard and seen everything that happened in the yard. Hua. Lin Ran called out and his cold gaze landed on Hua Qian's sword. Are you ready? Chapter 75. A monkey calls the shots in the mountain where there is no tiger. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 75. A monkey calls the shots in the mountain where there is no tiger. Translator. Henyi Translations Editor. Henyi Translations, Tainyo from the Northern Mystic Gate, Zhao Taiping from Mount Wufeng, Lu Fangxia from the Silver Cave, Zhou Jiqing from the Goddess Peak, and Huang Sanfeng from Mount Qianyuan. Hua Qian listed a few names with a faint smile. He actually recognized those people just from their voices. Lin Ran looked at Hua Qian in surprise. You've really not wasted the past few years wandering around the country. You know a lot of people, don't you? I've killed many people from these 5 sections. After Empress Sister ascended the throne, they have secretly expressed their dissatisfaction many times. If people from the martial world participated in the rebellion, they must be among them. As Hua Qian spoke, he took out a white handkerchief and folded it into a triangle to cover his face. Seeing this, Lin Ran asked curiously, "What are you doing? Are you afraid that they'll seek revenge?" "I'm afraid they won't dare to seek revenge." Hua Qian shook his head and smiled. "These people are just small fries. If they run away in fear when they see me, how can they catch the big fish?" "I see." Lin Ran nodded. He thought that the martial artists who dared to attend the banquet must have a clear conscience, but now it seemed that he had underestimated these people's courage. After a quick explanation, Hua Qian signaled Lin Ran to remain silent. Then, the two of them pricked up their ears and listened quietly. After everyone sat down, the banquet officially began. The Empress raised her cup to thank everyone. She did not expect Tainyo to make a scene again. "I didn't help during the rebellion. I won't drink this wine." After Tainyo finished speaking, he poured the wine in his cup onto the ground. Immediately, everyone gasped. No matter what occasion it was, this would be considered a great offense. Even so, the Empress did not show any anger. Instead, she chuckled and said, "Tainyo is indeed straightforward. However, if you don't want to drink the wine, why did you come?" "Of course it's for him." Tainyo pointed at the empty seat beside the Empress. "That place is reserved for the sword god, right? He has been missing for decades. I rushed over because I wanted to see if it was true that he had come out of seclusion." A cold glint flashed across the Empress's eyes, but it disappeared in an instant. She continued to raise her glass and smiled. "In that case, you have to drink this glass of wine even more because this is also a banquet I hold for the sword god." "For the sword god?" Everyone was in an uproar. From what the Empress said, the rumor that the sword god had come out of seclusion was most likely true. But why didn't he appear? Just as everyone was feeling puzzled, Tainyo asked, "Why didn't he show up then?" "According to the rules of my sect, if one is late, one will be punished to drink 3 glasses of wine." The Empress chuckled. "Sure thing. However, you have to down your glass of wine before you can see him." "Is that so? Then I'll drink it." As Tainyo spoke, he raised his wine cup and said, "Servant, fill my cup." After he finished speaking, none of the eunuchs stepped forward. Tainyo couldn't help but look displeased. He glared at them and said angrily, "Are you all deaf? I said fill my cup. Your glass of wine is on the ground." The Empress said coldly with no trace of a smile on her face, "Guard, help Tainyo finish his wine." As soon as she finished speaking, 2 guards rushed over. They grabbed Tainyo's arms and restrained him. Before Tainyo could react, they grabbed his head and pinned him against the ground. Ouch! Tainyo was caught off guard and his front teeth were broken. The smell of blood instantly filled his mouth, and his eyes turned red. He wanted to attack, but just as he released his 4th-level martial master aura, the 2 guards released their aura at the same time. They were at the 6th level of the martial master realm. At the same time, the other guards by the palace wall seemed to have received a signal. They pressed their hands on the hilts of their swords and released their auras. Among them, the 6th level of the martial master realm was the lowest. Some of them had even reached the realm of senior martial master. It had to be known that the average realm of the sect masters and elders present was only at the senior martial master realm. Grand Master realm was rare, and most of them had sided with the Empress. The few sect masters and elders who were about to stand up to help sat back down silently, lowering their heads as if this matter had nothing to do with them. Tainyo was already furious after being restrained. Seeing that no one was helping him, he became even angrier. He struggled and shouted, "Sect Master Chen! Elder Huang! Master Zhao! You promised to help me. Why aren't you saying anything now?" The ones who were mentioned hurriedly covered their faces with their hands. Tainyo looked to the other side and said, "Sect Master Lu. What did you say last night at the 8-directional mountain? Shut up. Master Lu shouted. He raised his hand and shot out a black shadow. It was so fast that the guards beside Tainyo could not react in time. The black shadow instantly pierced through Tainyo's head and nailed him to the ground. It was actually an ordinary bamboo chopstick. Blood splattered and the scene was in an uproar. The sect masters and elders had solemn expressions. It was not because someone died, but because they did not expect Master Lu to be able to kill with bamboo chopsticks. Protect His Majesty. Li Tianyi hurriedly shouted at the top of his lungs. Before the guards present could move, Master Lu had already stood up and knelt on the ground. Your Majesty. This person has repeatedly spoken rudely to you and ignored the rules of the palace and the dignity of the royal family. I can't take it anymore, so I killed him here as a warning to others. Please forgive me for disturbing such a joyful occasion. When the Empress heard this, her face turned ashen. She knew that Master Lu was trying to silence Tainyo, but she did not have any evidence to accuse him of that. At this moment, she could not punish people rashly. She could only wave her hand and force a smile. Master Lu, you did it to uphold the rule. What kind of crime? The crime of deceiving the emperor. A cold shout interrupted the Empress. Immediately after that, a white figure rushed in from outside the gate of Supreme Harmony. Accompanied by the sound of a sharp blade being unsheathed, a cold light came straight at Master Lu. Everyone cried out in shock. Master Lu also sensed that something was wrong. He released all his power and instantly flashed behind the white figure. He was about to attack when another even more majestic aura descended from the sky. A powerful sword intent exploded out of thin air. Everyone present was instantly so shocked that their faces turned pale. Even though they had already activated their cultivation to resist, they were still pressed to the ground by the pressure and could not move. A monkey calls the shots in the mountain where there is no tiger. A cold laugh sounded. Everyone lying on the ground turned their heads with difficulty and saw a figure walking over from outside the gate. Dressed in a black embroidered robe with dragon patterns and equipped with dragon roar, he gave off a dignified aura that made people not dare to resist. 10-Mile Sword God. Half Saint Realm. The 200 or so martial artists came to a conclusion at the same time. The rumors were true. The 10-Mile Sword God had really come out of seclusion. Chapter 76. Settling the score. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 76. Settling the score. Translator. Henyi Translations Editor. Henyi Translations. Lin Ran had already mastered the control of his sword intent very well. In the huge yard, only the martial artists were affected by the pressure. The others did not feel anything unusual. As the main target, Master Lu's body bore almost half of the pressure. He lay on the ground like a pool of mud and could not move. Just rolling his eyes was enough to exhaust all his strength. Seeing that familiar face, Master Lu immediately felt a chill run down his spine. Damn the demon. Why did he say the sword god is dead? Bullsh *T. Sect Master Lu cursed in his heart, but he forced a fawning smile on his face and squeezed out a sentence from between his teeth. Sword God. I'm Lu Yuntao. You even gave me pointers back then. This is all a misunderstanding, a misunderstanding. Lin Ran pretended not to hear him and strolled past expressionlessly. The moment he walked past Lu Yuntao's head rolled off from his body. There was still a smile on his face, as if he didn't know that he was dead. That power Lin Ran possessed that could kill a grandmaster instantly caused the expressions of the other sect masters to turn ashen. Under everyone's horrified gazes, Lin Ran walked up to the desk and bowed respectfully to the Empress. Greetings, Your Majesty. As soon as he finished speaking, the raging sword intent calmed down. Everyone felt their bodies lighten. They hurriedly stood up to bow. Greetings, 10-Mile Sword God. Unlike when they greeted the Empress previously, everyone's voices were filled with respect. The Empress stood up personally and said, "Senior Sword God, there's no need for formalities. Please take your seat. Your Majesty, please wait a moment. I still have something to do." After saying that, Lin Ran turned to face the martial artists on both sides and glanced at them indifferently. Among the remaining 259 people, only a dozen or so dared to look at him. Lin Ran pointed at Lu Yuntao, who was beheaded. "Do you know why I killed him?" Those who could attend the state banquet as representatives of their sex were naturally not fools. They were all well aware of the situation just now, but at this moment, no one spoke. Only Sun Daolin, the sect master of the Dark Cloud sect, who sat on the first row, stood up and said in a low voice, "Tainyo has repeatedly offended His Majesty, but according to what he said, he was clearly instructed to do this. However, he was killed by Master Lu before he could finish speaking. I think Master Lu must have a guilty conscience, right?" Everyone nodded, agreeing to what Sun Daolin said. However, to their surprise, the 10 Miles Sword God sneered and shook his head. No, Sun Daolin couldn't help but look puzzled. "Senior Sword God, please enlighten me. Do I need to give you an explanation for killing someone?" Lin Ran's voice was calm, but it was domineering. Everyone's expressions changed slightly. Lin Ran called out a few more names. "Where are the people from Northern Mystic Gate, Silver Cave, Goddess Peak, Mount Shenyuan, and Windy Creek Valley?" The faces of the people who were called out turned pale. Others might not know the reason why they were called out, but they knew very well. Plop. A square-faced middle-aged man knelt down. "Sword God, please spare me. I was just deceived by someone. I have no intention of rebelling." With the first person taking the lead, the rest also hurriedly knelt down to beg for mercy. The huge yard was immediately filled with cries. Lin Ran pressed those people to the ground with majestic pressure and said coldly, "Since you were deceived, tell me who the deceiver is." The middle-aged man who was the first to beg for mercy was overjoyed. "Sword God. Will I be spared if I tell you?" "I can't." Lin Ran said calmly, "But if you don't tell me, my disciple will make you beg for death." Disciple. The 10 Miles Sword God took in a disciple. This was not less mind-blowing than the appearance of the Sword God. Everyone's expressions changed again as they looked at the white-robed person who had assassinated Lu Yuntao in unison, wanting to see who this person was. Hua Qiyun was standing in the yard pretending to be cool. When he heard this, his expression turned cold. This was not in the plan they had discussed previously. Lin Ran was taking advantage of him. However, under everyone's gaze, Hua Qiyun couldn't expose him directly. He could only grit his teeth and bow to Lin Ran. When the Empress saw this scene, she almost couldn't help but laugh out loud. She hurriedly raised her glass to hide her smile, but she didn't expect the people present to misunderstand her action. Seeing her raise her glass, they hurriedly raised their glasses and congratulated, "Congratulations to Sword God for getting a disciple. Congratulations to Senior God for getting a disciple." More than 200 people congratulated him in unison. The veins on Hua Qiyun's forehead were about to pop out. He accidentally saw Zhao Taiping reach into his pocket sneakily and immediately rushed forward. With a flash of cold light, another head fell to the ground. With a thud, the corpse fell to the ground and the hand fell out, holding a dagger. Everyone gasped. In the blink of an eye, 3 lives were taken here. No matter how slow on the uptaking they now understood the situation at this moment. These 3 people came to the banquet with ulterior motives, but they did not expect the 10 Miles Sword God to see through them. Apart from being shocked, everyone was more afraid of the 10 Miles Sword God. They all tried to recall if they had done anything inappropriate. Seeing how ruthless Hua Qiyun was, Lin Ran knew that he was really angry with him, so he stopped teasing him and continued with a serious expression, "Those who claim to be deceived. If you can tell me who the deceiver is, I'll give you a quick death. Even Lu Yuntao, who was at the Grandmaster realm, was dead. How could the people who were called out earlier dare to say so? They immediately threw out some names. Almost at the same time, those people were beheaded by Hua Qiyun. In the blink of an eye, only the few people Lin Ran had called out before were left standing. The strong smell of blood filled the air. Even though these sect masters and elders were experienced and knowledgeable, they couldn't help but feel a little terrified. They lowered their heads and didn't dare to look at Lin Ran and Hua Qiyun, worried that they would be next. In the strange and solemn atmosphere, Lin Ran slowly held the hilt of the 10-mile dragon roar and looked at the traitors coldly. Let me ask you one more time, do you want to die or live? Chapter 77. Killing 3 birds with 1 stone. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 77. Killing 3 birds with 1 stone. Translator. Henyi Translations Editor. Henyi Translations. Those people originally thought that they were definitely going to die. When they heard this, their hopes were immediately reignited. They hurriedly kowtowed and shouted, "We want to live. We want to live. In that case, I'll give you a chance." Lin Ran nodded and pointed at the corpses that had just been killed. It's impossible for such a small fry to mobilize so many people. I'll give you 3 days to find out who's behind this. Before he could finish speaking, a young girl suddenly stood up and said, "Sword God. I'm Zhou Jiqing, a disciple of the goddess Peak. I know who the mastermind is." Oh. Lin Ran was a little surprised, but Zhou Jiqing pointed at Lu Yuntao, who was beheaded. These people today were all bewitched by Master Lu of the 8-directional mountain. As soon as she finished speaking, the remaining traitors nodded repeatedly, indicating that Zhou Jiqing was right. Lin Ran's expression under the mask instantly froze. He killed Lu Yuntao just to intimidate everyone, but he did not expect to have killed the mastermind. But on second thought, Lin Ran felt that something was wrong. Before King Zhao rebelled, he had eavesdropped on the secret meeting and knew that the Tao-seeking sect participated as the representative of the martial world. Why did it become the 8-directional mountain? Lin Ran was puzzled, but he couldn't ask directly. Logically speaking, the 10-mile sword god had just come out of seclusion and shouldn't know so much. After thinking for a moment, Lin Ran could only choose to interrogate them in private. Then, he waved at Hua Qiyun, indicating for him to take these people away first. Hua Qiyun nodded and brought people to take the traitors away. Then the guards went forward to carry the corpses away, but no one cleaned up the blood. Large pools of blood coagulated on the ground, as if it was a silent warning to the people. Lin Ran finally sat back down. The Empress raised her glass and said a few words before indicating that the dishes could be served. Hundreds of palace maids served delicacies on the table. Even the empty seats were not left out. The fragrance of the delicacies mixed with the pungent smell of blood made the atmosphere of the banquet especially strange. The Empress stood up again and raised her wine glass. "Everyone. There's something I didn't mention just now. Today's banquet is held to express my gratitude to you all as well as to announce that Sword God is back. In fact, there's a third thing." When everyone heard this, they looked confused. Lin Ran stood up and said, "King Zhao has been executed for his rebellion, but during his rebellion, he received the help of many in the martial world. The people I killed just now are among them. However, the Heavenly Saint dynasty is vast and there are still many traitors who have yet to be caught. On the invitation, it was written that those who can't make it in time to the state banquet must hang a yellow flag outside the gate to show respect to the emperor. Today, I'll ask all of you to bear witness. Anyone who doesn't have a yellow flag outside their gates will be treated as a traitor and killed without mercy." With that, Lin Ran's figure shot into the sky from the ground with the sword intent and instantly turned into a stream of light that disappeared into the horizon. "Sword God, I wish you a triumphant return." The Empress shouted loudly. Then, she raised her wine glass and drank it in one gulp. Sword God, I wish you a triumphant return. The sect masters and elders present also raised their cups to express their good wishes. At the same time, they were secretly shocked. Even though they did not participate in the rebellion, they had heard about it. The new emperor killed King Zhao and a group of important ministers in one day, but he did not punish those martial artists who had participated. At first, everyone thought that the new emperor was being lenient. They did not expect that the emperor was just waiting for the 10-mile sword god to come out of seclusion. For a moment, apart from being terrified by the 10-mile sword god, everyone present was also a little afraid of the new emperor who had just ascended the throne. To be able to rope in people, intimidate people, and eliminate people concurrently at a state banquet, this new emperor was indeed not simple. At the same time, outside Mingzhou Hall, Hua Qiyun had already taken off his mask and was pacing back and forth in the courtyard. Suddenly, he heard a whoosh. He turned around and saw Lin Ran quietly landing behind him. You really dare to come back? Hua Qiyun had a smile on his face, but his voice was extremely cold. Why didn't you act according to plan just now? You even called me your disciple. Who said I wanted to be your disciple? Lin Ran smiled calmly. Who said you're my disciple? You're clearly the disciple of the 10-mile sword god. Let's not talk about this first. Hurry up and take off my mask. I'm suffocating, I can't. Hua Qiyun rolled his eyes. Didn't I tell you that once you put on this mask, it will take at least 3 days to take it off? 3 days. Lin Ran was shocked. Why didn't you say so earlier? Am I going to wear this mask for 3 days? Oh, then maybe I forgot. Hua Qiyun slapped his forehead and looked at Lin Ran with a faint smile. 3 days is the minimum. If this adhesive is good, it might take more than half a month. Lin Ran instantly understood. It's pure retaliation. I learned it from you. Shifu. Hua Qiyun teased and waved his hand impatiently. Now, let's get down to business. I interrogated those people just now, but the situation was a little strange. You should come and take a look yourself. With that, Hua Qiyun entered Mingzhou Hall. Although Lin Ran was angry, he could only follow him in. The traitors were knocked out and tied up in a corner. Hua Qiyun picked up a few pieces of paper from the table and handed them to Lin Ran with a frown. These are their confessions. Take a look. Lin Ran took it. The confessions of the traitors were basically about how Lu Yuntao incited them to rebel and how they refused. In the end, they were forced to agree because of being threatened. Only Zhou Jiqing's confession mentioned that she had once overheard Lu Yuntao talking to someone in the 8-directional mountain. She did not see who the person was, but she heard that Lu Yuntao called him Supreme Mo. Lin Ran asked casually, who is this Supreme Mo? You've been traveling around for so many years, so you should know a little about him, right? The 8-directional mountain was the second largest sect in the Heavenly Saint dynasty. For Lu Yuntao to receive someone alone, this person was definitely not ordinary. It was impossible for Hua Qiyun not to know. However, to Lin Ran's surprise, Hua Qiyun shook his head. Lin Ran was stunned. What do you mean? You don't know or you don't want to tell me? I don't know. Hua Qiyun said with a solemn expression, I've been traveling in the martial world for so many years and have even visited those hidden sects that haven't been listed on the sacred martial roll, but I've never heard of the name, Supreme Mo. Lin Ran's expression changed slightly. Could he be someone from the Great Yong dynasty? Hua Qiyun shook his head again and subconsciously looked at the unconscious Zhou Jiqing. He muttered with a complicated expression, according to her description, I feel that this Supreme Mo might not be human. Chapter 78. Danger. Quickly return. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 78. Danger. Quickly return. Translator. Henyi Translations Editor. Henyi Translations Lin Ran originally had some clues, but when he heard Hua Qiyun's words, he was instantly confused. Not human. What's that? Could it be a phone? Is Lu Yuntao actually on the phone with someone else? What's a phone? Hua Qiyun asked in confusion. Before Lin Ran could explain, he shook his head. Forget it. You can ask her. As he spoke, Hua Qiyun took out a small porcelain bottle to shake under Zhou Jiqing's nose. Soon, Zhou Jiqing opened her eyes, but when she saw the 10-mile sword god standing in front of her, her eyes rolled back and she was about to faint again. Don't be afraid. He won't kill you. Only then did Zhou Jiqing hold on and not faint. However, her face was pale and her body was trembling. It was obvious that she was still frightened. Seeing this, Lin Ran said in a friendly tone, as long as you cooperate obediently, I won't kill you. Tell me about that, Supreme Mo. Yes, I'll tell you. Zhou Jiqing nodded and took a few more breaths before explaining, I saw Supreme Mo at the 8-directional mountain last night. No, I didn't see him. I only heard him talking to Lu Yuntao in private. I heard them mention something like Sword Mountain Fate, but I was discovered before I could hear much. After that, I was stunned by a wave of sword intent. I've never seen such a strange sword intent. It's unlike ordinary sword intent, and it gives off a very cold feeling. It felt as if I've fallen into an ice cave. Like falling into an ice cave. Lin Ran felt that this description was a little familiar, but he couldn't remember it at the moment. He looked at Hua Qiyun and asked, just based on these two descriptions, you're certain that Supremo Mo isn't human? Isn't that a little arbitrary? Hua Qiyun pursed his lips. I didn't say that I was certain. I just have this feeling. Lin Ran's lips twitched. Feel whatever you like. The state banquet should be over by now. I'll go ask His Majesty something first. With that, Lin Ran turned around and left. He had made an appointment with the Empress last night. After the state banquet ended, she would tell him why Daoistly looked exactly like the 10-mile sword god. Hua Qiyun could roughly guess what Lin Ran was going to ask. He sighed with a complicated expression and knocked Zhou Jiqing unconscious again. Then, he took out a porcelain bottle and walked towards the others. After leaving Mingzhou Hall, Lin Ran went straight to the Imperial Study. Now that he couldn't take off the mask of the 10-mile sword god, it was much more convenient for him to walk in the palace. As he had expected, the Empress was indeed in the Imperial Study. When she saw Lin Ran, she couldn't help but sigh. Lord Lin, you came so early. Do you really want to know so much? I just don't want to be kept in the dark by my friend. As Lin Ran spoke, he moved a chair and sat opposite the Empress. Tell me, what are you hiding from me? Actually, you're not the first to pretend to be the 10-mile sword god. Lin Ran's expression changed. It was not because the news was shocking, but because he did not expect the Empress to be so straightforward. According to Lin Ran's previous speculation, even if the Empress agreed to tell him, he would still have to nag her. After half a minute, Lin Ran came back to his senses. What do you mean? What do you mean that I'm not the first to pretend to be the sword god? Literally. The Empress smiled, but there was a hint of bitterness in her smile. Back then, after Grandpa Sword God went into seclusion, the Great Yong dynasty in the north began to make trouble. At that time, the Heavenly Saint dynasty was weak. Once the war started, we would definitely lose. Helpless, my father found someone to pretend to be Grandpa Sword God, hoping to intimidate the Great Yong dynasty, and that person is Daoistly. Lin Ran nodded in understanding, then looked puzzled. But if that's the case, why is Daoistly guarding Mount Sword? Why is he blind? The Empress revealed a sly look. I only said that I would tell you why Daoistly looks like Grandpa Sword God. As for why he's blind and why he's guarding Mount Sword, that's another matter. Lin Ran was speechless. You're cheating. Lin Ran was frustrated. Suddenly, he thought of something and smiled. I found out something just now. It might be related to the Great Yong Dynasty. Hearing the words, Great Yong Dynasty, the Empress's expression instantly turned serious. Tell me. Lin Ran smirked. Then tell me why Daoist Li is blind first. The Empress's expression turned cold. Lord Lin, please don't forget who you are. You can't use matters related to the Great Yong Dynasty to bargain with me. Seeing that the Empress was so serious, Lin Ran realized that he had gone overboard. Although the two of them were considered friends, the Empress was still the ruler of the Heavenly Saint Dynasty. When it came to state affairs, she would not show any mercy. After realizing this, Lin Ran revealed an apologetic expression. Then, he roughly explained the results of Hua Qian's interrogation. After a pause, he added, at the moment, we're still investigating the identity of this Supreme Mo, but if it's a person, it's most likely someone from the Great Yong Dynasty. The Empress thought for a moment and nodded. Qian knows the sex of the Heavenly Saint Dynasty very well. If he says that there's no such person, there definitely isn't. However, Lu Yuntao is already dead. How are you going to investigate? Lin Ran smiled. That's simple. Supreme Mo has been to the 8-directional mountain before, so he'll definitely leave traces. Perhaps he's still in the mountain. If we act as soon as possible, we might be able to catch him. The Empress's eyes lit up. You are right. I order you to go to the 8-directional mountain immediately and find out who this Supreme Mo is. Now. Lin Ran was stunned. He didn't expect the Empress to be so impatient. Seeing that Lin Ran was unwilling, the Empress suddenly thought of something and teased with a faint smile, why? You don't want to leave after staying in the palace for a few days. Is it because your heart is stolen by one of the consorts in the harem? Lin Ran was speechless. Don't talk nonsense. According to the previous plan, I should go to the Tao-seeking sect first. After all, they were really involved in the rebellion. Now that I suddenly have to go to the 8-directional mountain, I'm afraid the Tao-seeking sect will take this chance to flee. The Empress began to hesitate. That makes sense. Why don't you and Qian split up? Just as Lin Ran was about to speak, he suddenly felt a sword intent rushing over. He instinctively raised his hand and grabbed it. It was a jade token that looked like a small sword. There were actually a few drops of blood on its surface. Seeing the blood, Lin Ran's expression changed slightly. He hurriedly infused his divine sense into it and realized that it was a message from Hua Qian. It said, danger. Return quickly. Chapter 79. Azura Hell, Strange Death Curse. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 79. Azura Hell, Strange Death Curse. Translator. Henyi Translations Editor. Henyi Translations. After Lin Ran explained the situation, the Empress said, there's blood on this jade token. It seems like it's really urgent. Go back first. I'll be there soon. Yes. Lin Ran agreed and instantly rushed out of the imperial study. When he arrived in the courtyard, he rode his sword and flew towards Mingzhao Hall. In less than 5 seconds, Lin Ran landed in the courtyard of Mingzhao Hall. Hua Qian was sitting alone on the stone steps at the entrance of the hall. His plain clothes were stained with blood, and even his face was covered in blood. The strong smell of blood was almost nauseating. Hua Qian frowned with a solemn expression, as if he was in great pain. He did not even notice Lin Ran's arrival. Lin Ran hurriedly used his divine sense to check, only to find that Hua Qian was not injured at all. Puzzled, he quickly walked forward and asked, what happened? Why are you in such a sorry state? Hearing the voice, Hua Qian finally came back to his senses. He looked up at Lin Ran and wanted to speak, but then he frowned and sighed. I can't explain it clearly. See for yourself. With that, Hua Qiyun stood up and went to the door. Just as he was about to push it open, he turned to look at Lin Ran. The situation inside is not good. You'd better prepare yourself. Lin Ran waved his hand to indicate that it was fine. Hua Qiyun took another deep breath and pushed the door open with a serious expression. Red. In Mingzhou Hall, there was a glaring scarlet color everywhere. The thick smell of blood almost spewed out. Broken limbs and torn clothes covered almost every inch of the door. The once beautiful and quiet Mingzhou Hall had already become a purgatory on earth. No matter how calm Lin Ran was, he couldn't help but be stunned by such a tragic scene. After a few minutes, Lin Ran came back to his senses and frowned at Hua Qiyun. What's going on? This place is not far from the Imperial Study. Why didn't I notice a battle happening? Hua Qiyun's eyes flickered. There's no battle here. There's no internal energy fluctuation at all. Lin Ran looked puzzled. If there was no battle, how did this place become like this? Follow me. Hua Qiyun walked in, as if he was already used to this tragic scene. Lin Ran hesitated for a moment outside the door before finally stepping over the threshold. The feeling under his feet was wet and sticky. Occasionally, he would step on someone's limb or leg. Staring at Hua Qiyun's back, Lin Ran tried his best not to be affected by this scene. Soon, the two of them arrived at the back hall of Mingzhou Hall. Previously, Hua Qiyun had captured 5 people from the state banquet. Among them, Zhao Taiping tried to sneak attack and was killed on the spot. The remaining 4 were brought to this place for interrogation. Lin Ran thought that the scene in the back hall would be better. However, when he entered the back hall, he realized that the scene was even more tragic than outside. Lin Ran asked Hua Qiyun, "Why did you bring me here?" Hua Qiyun asked back, "Didn't you notice anything wrong? This place is even more tragic than the outside. It should be the first place where the accident happened. Look closely." Lin Ran took another glance across the hall and realized that 2 of the 4 prisoners had gone missing. Only a man and a woman were left behind in a corner. Their faces were covered in blood. Lin Ran could only recognize Zhou Jiqing, whom he had just questioned. As for the other, he couldn't recognize him at all. Where are they? Why are there 2 missing? Lin Ran asked subconsciously, but he saw Hua Qiyun smile strangely and spin his finger a few times. They are everywhere. Everywhere. Lin Ran muttered to himself and was shocked. Are you saying that those 2 people exploded and died? Hua Qiyun nodded. You asked me to continue investigating, so I interrogated them again and asked them about Supreme Mo. The first person I interrogated was Lu Fangxia from Silver Cave. When I asked about Supreme Mo, she first said that she didn't know, but I realized that she was obviously hiding something, so I used some methods. In the end, she still gave in. It turned out that she had also eavesdropped on Lu Yuntao and Supreme Mo's conversation last night. However, she was not as lucky as Zhou Jiqing. After eavesdropping for a while, she was caught by them on the spot. Lin Ran's heart skipped a beat. In that case, she must know what Supreme Mo looks like. Hua Qiyun nodded, his eyes revealing a hint of fear, as if he had thought of something extremely terrifying. I asked her to describe Supreme Mo's appearance, but just as she was about to answer, suddenly, halfway through, Hua Qiyun suddenly stopped and raised his hand to make an explosion gesture. At that time, I didn't understand what was going on, so I continued to interrogate Huang Sanfeng. As expected, when he opened his eyes and saw this hellish scene, he was immediately frightened out of his wits. I only scared him a little and he confessed everything. Lin Ran thought for a moment and made a guess, let me guess. He also overheard the conversation between Lu Yuntao and Supreme Mo and was caught on the spot. But when he was about to describe Supremo Mo, his body exploded and he died. Hua Qiyun nodded. But this time, I sensed the explosion coming and quickly slapped him into the outer hall at the last moment. However, I don't dare to interrogate the remaining two. Then you might as well let him explode here. If the palace servants in charge of cleaning see this, they will definitely curse you behind your back. Lin Ran casually joked to ease the atmosphere and analyzed seriously, the timing of their deaths is too coincidental. I think it's most likely Lu Yuntao or Supreme Mo had cast some kind of restriction on their bodies. Once they want to reveal Supreme Mo's identity, their bodies will explode and they'll die. That's what I thought, but it's wrong. Hua Qiyun denied Lin Ran's guess. After Lu Fangxia died, I thought of this. However, after my examination, I found no restrictions on the bodies of the remaining 3 people, but Huang Sanfeng still died. No restrictions. Lin Ran found it hard to believe when he heard that. If the restriction existed, then everything could be explained. However, if there was no restriction, why would Lu Fangxia and Huang Sanfeng explode and die for the same reason? Could it be a coincidence? Chapter 80. The Identity of Supreme Mo. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 80. The Identity of Supreme Mo. Translator. Henyi Translations Editor. Henyi Translations. After frowning and thinking for a long time, Lin Ran still had no clue. He felt that the restriction should be the only explanation. Lin Ran looked at Hua Qiyun. Could it be that you're too weak so you can't find the restriction? Hua Qiyun looked displeased when he heard this, but he realized that Lin Ran was serious about it. He spread his hands and said, maybe. There are 2 more. Why don't you check them yourself? Looking at the 2 figures covered in blood in the corner, Lin Ran really didn't want to get close, but he had no choice but to walk over. Lin Ran hesitated for a moment and finally decided to start with Zhou Jiqing. The 2 of them were both covered in blood, so it was naturally better to start with the young girl. However, before Lin Ran could touch Zhou Jiqing, there was a light knock on the door. Lin Ran and Hua Qiyun looked at each other and had no choice but to put off the examination for the time being. They turned around and went to the front hall. Hua Qiyun was about to open the door when Lin Ran reminded him, let's see who it is first. Your Empress sister said that she would come over. This place is so terrifying. If she comes, tell her to go back. Got it. Hua Qiyun agreed and looked out through the crack in the door. Then, he turned around and looked at Lin Ran with a strange expression. Seeing this, Lin Ran couldn't help but feel a little anxious. Why are you looking at me? Tell me who's outside. The person outside. Hua Qiyun hesitated for a moment before saying in an extremely strange tone, it seems to be you. Lin Ran was stunned. Hua Qiyun said, no, more precisely, it is you. What do you mean it's me? What the hell are you talking about? When Lin Ran heard this, he felt a headache coming on. He had no choice but to go forward and check it out himself. However, when he saw who it was outside, his mind was blown away. The person standing outside the door was none other than himself. What the f***ck? Why is everything strange happening on the same day? Lin Ran rubbed his eyes and looked again. He realized that the person outside was indeed him dressed as the commander of the Imperial Guards. Hua Qiyun asked softly, what's going on? Why did anyone even bother to impersonate you? Impersonate? Lin Ran suddenly thought of something and asked softly through the door, Your Majesty. Is that you? Lin Ran, who was outside the door, nodded. It's me. Open the door. Hearing the Empress's voice, the 2 people in the room looked at each other and did not know whether to laugh or cry. Lin Ran was impersonating the 10-mile sword god, and the Empress was impersonating Lin Ran. Hua Qiyun, who was still his original identity, inexplicably felt isolated. After a moment of silence, Hua Qiyun leaned close to the door and whispered, Empress sister. The scene here is a little, not good. Why don't you go back first? When the Empress heard this, her expression darkened. Nonsense. I'm just here to see what's going on. how can I leave just like that? Lin Ran also advised, you should listen to Hua. The scene here is really not suitable for you to see. I ascended the throne at the age of 19. I've been through a lot and seen a lot. What's there to be afraid of? The Empress asked coldly, clearly displeased. Lin Ran and Hua Qiyun looked at each other. Hua Qiyun said in a low voice, let's open the door. Otherwise, with Empress sister's temper, she'll probably barge in. Lin Ran nodded helplessly. The two of them told the Empress to get ready before slowly opening the door a crack. The Empress's expression immediately changed when she saw the terrifying scene in Mingzhou Hall through the crack in the door. However, the Empress was brave. After a moment, she calmed herself down and asked softly with a frown, why did Mingzhou Hall become like this? What did you do? Seeing that the Empress was not scared away, Lin Ran opened the door and invited her in. Then, in a few words, he roughly explained what had happened. The Empress pondered for a moment. In that case, there might indeed be some kind of restriction. What's the result of your examination? I was just about to do it when you came. Lin Ran shrugged helplessly and gestured to the back hall. If you're not afraid, why don't you come and take a look? The Empress raised her head slightly. Lead the way. When the three of them returned to the back hall, Lin Ran placed his hand on Zhou Jiqing's shoulder. After some investigation, he realized that just as Hua Qiyun had said, there were no traces of restrictions in her body. After shaking his head to indicate that he didn't find anything, Lin Ran placed his hand on the other person's shoulder. He didn't have much hope at first, but as soon as his divine sense was released, he immediately felt a familiar power. It was not sword intent or internal energy. This power was cold and cruel. It hid in the man's body like a poisonous snake waiting for an opportunity in the shadows. At the same time, this power was extremely subtle. If Lin Ran wasn't a half-saint, he probably wouldn't have noticed it. There's something in him. As Lin Ran spoke, he released more divine sense. At the same time, the feeling that he had seen this force somewhere before surged in his heart. Upon hearing that, the Empress immediately asked, what is it? Is it a restriction? Lin Ran shook his head and raised his hand to signal her not to speak. As his divine sense gradually entered deeper into the person's body, the familiar feeling became stronger. After recalling carefully for a moment, Lin Ran's expression changed drastically. I remember now. I've seen this power before. The Empress's expression froze. Could it be that you've seen Supreme Mo before? Where did you see him? The nameless cave at the peak of Mount Sword. Lin Ran felt a chill run down his spine. This cold and evil aura was exactly the same as the evil aura in the cave where the sword god was buried. The so-called Supreme Mo was probably the demon who killed the sword god and broke out of the seal. When Lin Ran discovered that the demon had escaped, he had been planning to track him down. However, he couldn't find any clues of his whereabouts, so he could only put it off for the time being and deal with something else first. Now that Lin Ran knew Supreme Mo was the demon, he needed to plan how to deal with him carefully. Lin Ran didn't know why Lu Yuntao had something to do with the demon, but he couldn't let the Empress know about this. If possible, it was best if no one else knew about it. BVEC, after all, this was no small matter. If the news spread to the world, it would probably cause greater unrest than a war.